Afternoon, good evening for someone who is joining us from a little bit farther away. And thank you for coming back online with us for this second week in the course on access to decent work for refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. And it is my feeling that the session today is a highly anticipated one, at least judging by the questions that we already started receiving during the previous session last week. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the legal and governance framework that is governing, let's say, the refugees' right to work for refugees and other displaced persons. And to do that today, I'm very happy to be in the company of two colleagues, Heloise Ruaudel, whom you've already met from the ILO, and Denise Baruch-Kotulla, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, from UNHCR. All of you are, I hope, already experts on how our webinars normally work, but let me just give you a very quick couple of instructions. The session is offered in both English and Arabic with simultaneous interpretation. So if you would like to listen to the Arabic version, please make sure to click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and then select the channel that you would like to listen to, either Arabic or English. This is important also for the speakers today will be speaking English, but this is important also for the English speakers in the virtual room, because if anyone is asking questions or making comments in Arabic, then to be able to hear the interpretation into English, you would also need to be able to access the English language from the bottom of your screen. We have two speakers today, so the session is quite packed, but we do have some time to spend together this morning. So let me take this opportunity to encourage you to try and make the most of the session. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if there's anything that you would like to share, any reflections, please feel free to intervene. You can do that in two ways, either by using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen or by writing in the chat box. And as I said, because we have interpretation available in this session, thanks to the contribution of the Youth for Future project in Egypt, please feel free to use whichever language you feel most comfortable with. So you can do it in either, excuse me, I'm seeing something on my, during the last session last week. And then we are going to move on to the labor market governance framework and the implications for refugees and other displaced persons with our colleague Heloise. So that's all in terms of announcements from my side. As usual, the session is being recorded in both English and Arabic, and we're going to do our best to make the recordings available on the eCampus as soon as possible after the end of the session, together with the PowerPoints as well. Now, without further ado, thank you very much to Denise for joining us today. Denise is a legal officer in the Protection Policy and Legal Advice section of the Division of International Protection at UNHCR's headquarters in Geneva. She is going to take the floor first. So Denise, thank you very much for joining. I'm going to share the screen with the presentation, and feel free to tell me when to move forward. And to maybe also confirm that you are seeing my screen.
Yes, thank you.
In full screen mode. Okay.
Yes, I see it in full
Thank
screen
you.
mode. Let me just.
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Miki, also for the introduction. And also, I just want to take the opportunity to thank the ILO for the invitation to this to speak at this course about the legal framework and the right to work for refugees. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Great. So I will I will try to speak slowly. We have a bit of a complex topic at times. I'll try to make it as clear as possible, hopefully, and also to help the interpreter catch up. And yeah, also my thanks to the interpreter for helping out on that. I will be starting today with a bit of a broader view, generally on UNHCR's mandate and the supervisory responsibility, because I also understand that this is the first time at this course that UNHCR is presenting, and then we will look a bit at the question of who is actually a refugee, and what are the different definitions that exist for a refugee, and also what is the difference to an asylum seeker, because I understand there were some questions on that before. And then we will be looking at the right to work for refugees. And then finally, we will look at the role of the Global Compact on Refugees, and also the role that the Global Refugee Forum is playing related to the topic that we're discussing today. If we could move to the next slide, please. So, as many of you probably know, UNHCR is a subsidiary organ to the United Nations. This means that it was established by a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly in 1950. And UNHCR is the organization that leads international action to protect people forced to flee, deliver life-saving support, safeguard fundamental human rights, and help develop solutions so that people who are forced to flee can build a better future for themselves. And UNHCR's statute provides the organization with a twofold mandate. So this is to provide international protection to refugees and to seek durable solutions for refugees together with states. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. One second. So in principle, UNHCR's work is non-political. This means it is impartial, and it is humanitarian and social in character. So for UNHCR, the concept of international protection is central to its responsibilities. The statute states that UNHCR's protection mandate includes promoting the ratification of relevant international conventions to protect refugees and to supervise the application of these conventions. And it is important to underline that the protection of displaced persons is primarily the responsibility of states. And UNHCR steps in where the state is unable or unwilling to provide the protection, and carries out its protection mandate in dialogue with the concerned state. UNHCR statute also calls upon states to cooperate with UNHCR, and the mandate on solutions emphasizes UNHCR's facilitation role and collaboration with states in finding solutions. So this includes voluntary return to the country of origin and integration in the country of asylum or third country, for example, through resettlement or through accessing complementary pathways. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, as I said before, I heard that there's been a few questions on the definition of a refugee. So I thought it would be helpful that we, at the beginning, take a look at the definition, and that I'll also be able to answer some questions in case there are any. So there are various instruments that define in international law who is a refugee. The primary instrument is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. So under the definition of the 1951 Convention, a refugee is a person who, due to a well-founded fear of persecution, for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of the country of origin and is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are some regional instruments, such as the 1969 OAU Convention in Africa and the 1984 Cartagena Declaration in the Americas, that complement the 1951 Convention, and they have built upon its definition. So they are complementary to the 1951 Convention. So as we have seen, the refugee definition in the 1951 Convention is focused on the risks of individual persecution. And the broader refugee criteria in the regional instruments is focused on risks coming from objective circumstances or more general risks. So the definition in the 1969 OAU Convention in Africa includes, for example, external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order. And the definition in the 1984 Cartagena Declaration includes generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violations of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So in short, and in general, and based on these three definitions that we have seen, we can say that refugees are all persons outside of their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order, and who as a result require international protection. And it is also important to note that every refugee, regardless of the definition under which they have been recognized as a refugee, enjoy the same rights under international law. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the difference between asylum seekers and refugees then? Asylum seeker, as you see on the left side of the slide, is a general term for any person who is seeking international protection. In some countries, it is used as a legal term, referring to a person who has applied for refugee status and has not yet received a final decision on their asylum claim. It can also refer to a person who has not yet submitted an application, but who may intend to do so in the future, or who may be generally in need of international protection. So this means that not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker. So if you look at the right side of the slide, a refugee is any person who meets the eligibility criteria under an applicable refugee definition, the definitions that we have seen before. It is important to note that under international law, a person is considered a refugee as soon as they meet the relevant criteria, whether or not they have been formally recognized as a refugee. So a person does not become a refugee because of recognition, but rather a person is recognized because they are a refugee. And asylum seekers are therefore to be treated as if they are refugees. However, this does not mean that asylum seekers must have access to all rights in the 1951 Convention. Rather, the access to rights in the 51 Convention is relative, as I will explain a bit later. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So under international law, the right to work is set out expressly in Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in Article 6 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICESCR. So states under international law are required to take steps progressively to realize for everyone within their jurisdiction, including refugees, the opportunity to gain a living by work, the ability to enjoy just and favorable conditions of work, and accessing social protection. So, and states need to do this in a non-discriminatory manner. So this may also answer the question, what happens in states that are not state parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention, because the right to work is a general human rights, right that also applies to refugees. And just to give you an idea, the 1951 convention has 149 state parties, but the ITCILO has 172 state parties. So it has a somewhat wider coverage than the 1951 convention. So the right to work includes the opportunity to gain a living by work that is freely chosen or accepted. However, the right to work does not include a guarantee of a job, but rather the right to access the labor market. For example, by being legally entitled to seek wage earning employment or start a business and produce and sell goods or services. And a person cannot be forced to engage in employment or be unfairly dismissed from it. Forced compulsory labor is explicitly prohibited, as are worst forms of child labor and labor interfering with the child's development. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. I don't know why the format of the slides have changed a little bit. I'm sorry about that. It was supposed to be all in the boxes. Somehow it moved out, at least on my screen. I don't know if I'm the only one who sees it like that. Yes, so the right to work, specifically in the 1951 Refugee Convention. The right to work, the right of refugees to access employment is explicitly recognized in the 1951 Convention and is recognized in Article 17 on wage earning employment, as you see in the first column, in Article 18 on self-employment in the middle column, and in Article 19 on liberal professions, which you see on the right column. And by liberal professions, what is meant are professions for which diplomas or other qualifications are required, and that can be organized and carried out independently, for example, lawyers, physicians, architects, engineers, and artists. So just to clarify, because this category sometimes causes a bit of confusion what is covered under this one. So before we move further on this and discuss a bit in detail what these articles mean, I just would like to clarify that generally in the 1951 Convention, the access to rights is relative in two ways. So it means the access to rights depends on two things. The first thing is that the access to right depends on the legal status of the person in the host country. So this means whether the person is a refugee or, as we saw earlier, an asylum seeker. And the differentiation is made by referring to persons lawfully staying in the country, which refers to refugees, or refugees lawfully in the country, which is understood to refer to asylum seekers. So the language can be a bit confusing, but just to be clear on that. And then the second aspect of how the rights are relative is that refugee rights also depend on the level how others in the country are treated by the law, either nationals of the country or non-nationals who are present in the country. So regarding the first point, the access of refugees to gainful employment under the 1951 Convention increases according to the presence or the residence and the length of the stay in the host country. So this means that asylum seekers who are lawfully in the country may seek access to self-employment opportunities, as you see in the middle column. And refugees who are lawfully staying in the country may also access wage earning employment and practice liberal professions, as under the left and right columns. And these articles also provide for a level of treatment, like I said, that is relative to the treatment provided to other non-nationals or to nationals of the country. So access to wage earning employment should be the same as the best treatment for non-nationals. So as you see in the left column. This means in countries that have treaties in place, for example, allowing access to labor market for nationals of certain states, for example, this is often the case in regional economic communities, then refugees must have the same access to the labor market. So they are supposed to be treated the same way as these non-nationals are treated who enjoy the best treatment in the country. And then after 3 years of residence, they must be provided with the same access as nationals. Access to self-employment and liberal professions should be as good as possible, but at least it should be the same as for foreigners who are generally in the same circumstances. So this means that states are encouraged to ensure that refugees receive the best treatment that other non-nationals receive, but in any event, they cannot be treated worse than other non-nationals. So it is more of a basic standard for the case of self-employment and liberal professions. And just to say to that as well, that generally, states are of course allowed to provide for a higher level of treatment or higher protection, better access to rights than is provided in the convention. So this is just a minimum standard. And also, at least as UNHCR, we have been advocating continuously, for example, to also provide asylum seekers with access to wage earning employment opportunities in the countries of asylum. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So international refugee law and international human rights law are complementary. So this means the rights in the 1951 Convention are to be read together with rights contained in international human rights law. And there's quite a range of rights that are relevant in this context. And most of them you will see are contained in the 51 Convention and also in the ITCILO. And some of those rights are specific to refugees because they are in a specific situation with specific challenges. So for example, this is particularly the case when it comes to identity documents and civil and travel documents, that refugees receive these documents from the country of asylum. So other rights that are relevant is non-discrimination, social security and public relief, the right to form and join trade unions, freedom of movement in the country, qualifications, training and education, intellectual property rights, and of course, effective remedies and access to courts. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as we have seen, states are allowed to differentiate between its nationals and refugees, and they're also allowed to differentiate between refugees and asylum seekers, and to gradually facilitate refugees' access to decent work opportunities. This can be reasonable due to limited available resources, capacity constraints, as well as specific needs and priorities in the country. However, it is important to note that refugees' engagement in income-generating activities is essential to the achievement of self-reliance of refugees. And it has been shown that refugees' access to decent work opportunities generally benefits the host communities and the domestic economy. And refugees left without any means to earn an income will likely be in need of support and social assistance. So to realize the opportunities of refugees to access decent work, states are required to take deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps. And these steps include, for example, adopting legislative, administrative, and financial measures to develop training programs and policies, developing national employment policies, ensuring that relevant legislation and other measures are in place, and also allocate available resources. And importantly, the international community as a whole, including humanitarian and development actors, need to show solidarity and offer assistance and cooperation to help states provide access to decent work for all, including refugees. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So how can this be done? Especially considering that 76% of the world's refugees are hosted in middle and low income countries. So the 1951 Refugee Convention recognized that asylum may place heavy burdens on countries and that international cooperation is needed to address these burdens in securing protection of refugees and finding solutions. And in 2019, the Global Compact on Refugees was affirmed by the United Nations General Assembly. So the GCR represents the political will and ambition of the international community for strengthened cooperation and solidarity with refugees and affected host countries. And the GCR is also a framework for more predictable and equitable responsibility sharing. And the GCR has 4 objectives. The first one is to ease the pressure on host countries, to enhance refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions in the countries of origin for return in safety and in dignity. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And the GCR importantly also established the Global Refugee Forum, which you might have heard about. The GRF is the world's largest international gathering on refugees, designed to support the practical implementation of the objects set out in the GCR. So in December 2023, the second Global Refugee Forum took place, and over 4,200 participants from 168 countries attended the forum, including over 300 refugee delegates, and a further 10,000 people followed the forum online. Importantly, 1,750 pledges were made at the Global Refugee Forum. About 1/3 of those were made by states, and about 2/3 of those were made by non-state actors. And important for the topic that we are discussing here today is that 1 in 4 pledges address economic inclusion and social protection. So it was a major topic discussed at the Global Refugee Forum. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what was new at this Global Refugee Forum is that stakeholders, for example, like states, international organizations, development actors, civil society, faith-based organizations, academia, the legal community, and also refugee, stateless, and IDP-led organizations, all these stakeholders came together in multi-stakeholder pledges to achieve the greatest impact possible and to try to move the needle on important thematic issues. So one multi-stakeholder pledge that I would like to highlight because it is important to the discussion is the multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection. And the objective was to encourage high-quality pledges in the areas of law and policy, programming, and data and evidence. And the objective is also to advance the access of refugees to decent work by including refugees in national systems and enhance their self-reliance, and to empower refugees to find solutions. So over 260 pledges were made under this multi-stakeholder pledge by a wide variety of actors. And over the next 4 years, these stakeholders will work together to support the implementation of the pledges made and to help states in taking deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps to realize opportunities for refugees to access decent work. And the good thing about these multi-stakeholder pledges is also that pledges that, for example, have been made by states who are hosting refugees can be supported by pledges made by other states, for example, donor states, who can then support the implementation of the pledges made by the host state, or also by other stakeholders like development actors or the academia or NGOs who could also pledge to support host states in providing access to economic inclusion and social protection in those countries. So that would be the presentation from my side, and I think we might go to either to questions or to Heloise's part of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you very much. Let me put my camera back on. So thank you for your presentation of your quite exhaustive overview. I see that Marion has already encouraged participants to share their comments or their questions in the Q&A box, so in the chat box here at the bottom right of your screen, or to raise your hand and we can give you the floor directly. We have quite a large number of participants again joining us today, but we can arrange for opening the floor directly if needed. And it's strange to me to see that there's a little bit of shyness and a bit of silence now in the chat box as opposed to the questions that we had last time. So I see that there's something already coming in. And I will ask the interpreters for their help, considering that the comments that are coming in or questions that are coming in are in Arabic. Please.
Jameen, yes, of course. So what are the, excuse me, I'm just reading on my sentence. How can the host countries help, and how can the donor countries help the host countries, especially those that have millions of refugees? This is the first question. The second question, what's the difference between a refugee and an immigrant?
Thank you. Denise, please. And then we have a raised hand from Wenya. So let's take the first two questions from the chat, and then Wenya, I will come back to your raised hand in a minute. Thank you for your patience. Denise?
Thanks so much. I'll take the second question first. What is the difference between a refugee and an immigrant? So from UNHCR's perspective and from an international refugee law perspective, you will hear us always make a difference between migrants and refugees. This is not necessarily the case when you will hear other actors speak. For example, in academia, they might use other terms, but at least because we are basing our work on the 1951 Refugee Convention, UNHCR will always be making a difference between the refugees and migrants. This is so the reason for that is because refugees are, like we saw in the definitions, they do not have a choice to move. They are forced to move. So they are forced to flee their country, and they have crossed an international border to seek international protection, because they are not, they cannot anymore enjoy the protection of their country of origin where they fled from. So they receive the protection by another country. And under international law, this is important because refugees have some specific rights under international law, as under the 1951 Refugee Convention, because of their specific situation. So they enjoy the general human rights within the wider human rights framework, but then they also have specific rights as refugees in their country of asylum. So if you look at migrants, on the other hand, you would rather say, I mean, even though some of their situation might be dire as well, they might, feel the need to leave their country to look for economic opportunities or for work opportunities or for education. But generally, they do not have the same level of threat as a refugee would have in returning to their country. So they might have many different reasons to leave their country and to move to a different country. So this is the legal difference between the two. And then on the question of what can the host country, if I understood correctly, the host country do, and also donor countries, right? Right. And I mean, maybe this is also something later on Heloise might want to say something about, but maybe just a few words from my side on that. So if we look, for example, at the situation of the approach that was taken during the Global Refugee Forum with the multi-stakeholder pledges, there's generally an encouragement for all states to provide access to decent work and to social protection for refugees in their country. But it is understood and accepted that this might be difficult, especially for countries who might be low or middle income and who are worried about their economy and therefore take a more protective approach to their labor market. So the idea is to have other stakeholders come in and to provide support to these countries so that they can say, okay, we will provide access to work, and not only to work, it might also be access to other rights, for example, access to freedom of movement, so that the refugees in the country can move around and can look for employment where they, you know, where there might be employment opportunities. So it's not necessarily limited to the access to employment, but also to other rights. And that other stakeholders have the opportunity to come in and to say, we are going to support this. This can be, of course, financially, by donor countries, for example, but it could also be technical cooperation, like technical expertise by development actors, for example, but it could also be support in the policy procedures, like to say the country needs to make some changes in their legal framework, so they receive some support and some advice on how to do that. But also, for example, NGOs who can come in, or other stakeholders who will say, we will support the objective that this country has set. For example, another important stakeholder is also the private sector, who could come in and who could help with job creation, etc. But these are the more practical aspects that I think other colleagues might be a bit more knowledgeable on, and I'll stick more to the legal questions.
Thank you, Denise. And yes, Heloise is saying that she is going to contribute, but also there's a question in the chat that we haven't yet gotten to that she may also have some contributions on. So let me first go back to Muenya, who has been very patiently waiting with their hand raised. Please, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Michela.
Good morning.
And thank you, Denise, for a very informative presentation. I wanted to ask something in relation to the legal framework. So I was thinking around, how do national laws come into play to enable the application of Convention 1951? Because I'm asking this because I understand that within the convention, there are provisions that may not come into effect if, for example, a member state or a country that has ratified does not ensure that the national laws have also taken into account the provisions of 1951. So I just wanted to find out, to what extent can we domesticate the international convention? And then I had also a second question, which is more just, I think, my broad thinking. Because when I look, when you look at international media news on Africa, you see a lot of people moving from Africa into Europe. And sometimes European countries don't want to take in these, don't know whether they're migrants or refugees. You may be able to clarify on that. So I wanted to find out, to what extent now does the convention compel member states to take in these refugees? Yeah, maybe you could explain on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that there's another raised hand, but we do have one question in the chat that I'm going to, so Ibrahim, I will ask you to maybe hold on to your raised hand for a moment. Can we take the questions 2 by 2? Denise, is that fine with you? So we go with Menya's questions first. And then I wonder if you have any words about the question that Nicolas has put in the chat. He's saying, thank you for the great insights and presentation. However, in some countries like Uganda, refugees and immigrants are not supposed to own fixed assets such as land, only to lease. And do you have any inputs on the international standards and practice on this? And we know that Heloise is going to tackle that in part of her presentation, but just if you have any words. And then Ibrahim, we will get to you in a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much for all these questions. So I will start with the first one on the domestication of the 1951 Convention and national laws. And this is a very good question and very spot on. So the 1951 convention as a convention does not have a system, like a strict monitoring system in place. For example, you might know the human rights mechanisms where there's some monitoring going on. So it is not like that for the 51 convention. So as I mentioned earlier, it is UNHCR's role to supervise the implementation of the convention and also to advise states on the implementation. So and one big part of our role is also to advise on the national laws and how to amend national laws that are already in place, or even how to draft and adopt national laws, for example, asylum laws. But this is not limited only to the asylum and the refugee law. So we would, of course, encourage states to have an asylum or refugee law in place. But this might also be all kinds of other laws, for example, related to labor rights, where we would encourage the inclusion of refugees and the inclusion of refugees also in national systems, in particular if it comes, for example, to social protection systems. So even though I'm saying it's somewhat the mandate of UNHCR, this is also something where stakeholders can come in and should come in to support also on the advocacy role. So, for example, there could be NGOs, especially local NGOs, who identify an issue or a gap in a national law and who would want to encourage law reform in that specific area. Or there could be academia, for example, who would say, we will conduct research and support the government in assessing the legal framework or what needs to be done. Sometimes it's not even to change the legal framework. Sometimes the legal framework is in place, but the implementation and practice is the challenge. So sometimes states need support to understand what do we need to do to make sure that the legal framework that we have in place is implemented. So there's all, like a whole range of stakeholders who can also come in there and who can be supportive in making sure that the national laws are in line with the 51 convention. And on the second question, yes, which was related to, I think, to the right to asylum, if I understood correctly. Or the right, it's actually, the right to under the 51 Convention to seek asylum. So yes, I mean, in principle, any person who arrives at an international border and expresses the need to seek asylum should have access to the asylum procedure and to have their claim heard. So that is, and I mean, you might be familiar also with the principle of non-refoulement in context with that, that the person should be allowed access and to make an asylum application and to go through the procedure. And this procedure should be fair and equal for everyone. So that's basically, I mean, I cannot say there's no necessarily rights to remain or to stay, but at least to have the opportunity to make your claim heard and to seek protection. And that is clearly an established principle under international law. And did I miss? I think I missed one. Oh yes, the question on the land question. I would actually really like to give this one to Heloise if she has a couple of words on that one.
Yes, thank you, Denise.
Great.
Definitely, I know that Heloise will have something to say about this. Heloise, with your permission, I would maybe wait and ask the question again at the end of your presentation, because I know that you will touch on some of this during the presentation, and I don't want to, give out spoilers before we get to the actual moment. We still have a bunch of questions in the chat. I know that Ibrahim has been very patient, so I will give the floor to him first, and then I'll pick another couple from the chat, and then we can pick them up again at the end of the session. Thank you. Ibrahim, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Denise, for the well-elaborate presentation. My question is with regards to disaster displacement and climate change displacement. You find that, especially in East Africa, that the advanced adverse impacts of climate change will force people to move across international borders. So my question will be, what are the legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of adverse effects of climate change and disasters? And what considerations should the government, the administrative authorities, the legal practitioners, and the judicial decision makers like the judges, what considerations should they put in place, or what should they consider in doing some assessments or in considering whether to grant asylum to people who are displaced due to adverse effects of climate change and disasters? And then again, you'll find that it's a challenge because you'll find that the displaced persons will only be temporarily protected in the neighboring country. And when the effects of climate change, maybe if there was drought and it starts raining, you'll find that they want to go back to their country of
Mickey,
origin.
excuse me, I cannot hear the speaker very well.
Ibrahim, can I stop you for a moment? Can I ask you to maybe speak a little bit closer to the microphone or speak a little bit slower, because I understand that the interpreters are having a bit of trouble following your intervention.
Okay, very well.
Thank you.
Let me just summarize the question.
Yes,
Or
please.
do we offer them complementary pathways or complementary protection, or is it some sort of temporary protection? And if that is the case, how is it captured in the 1951 convention or the 69 convention or the national laws? How do we consider that in developing the national laws? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. So before we before we hear from you, Denise, I would like to highlight just a couple of other points that I see emerging in the discussion in the chat. There is a question by Mariam who has to do with the provision of work permits. And I would maybe pause this for the moment and come back to it after the presentation by Heloise, because I know that she's also going to touch on this quickly in her presentation. We can elaborate further on that afterwards. But there are two points that I wanted to also raise. One is from Mohammed. He is asking, do you think the Global Compact on refugees might influence international law, instruments, or customary law, particularly regarding the economic rights of refugees? So how do you see this evolving? And also from Abdurrahim, and this is a question that came up also last week, for countries that are not signatory to the 1951 Convention so far, how does UNHCR suggest or provide advice or convince these countries to legally recognize refugees' access to work? So these three points. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you so much. So I'll take, and thank you, Ibrahim, for your question on the climate change. That's indeed a very, very interesting question. So since you asked me specifically about the context in Eastern Africa, so to the of climate change and the adverse impacts of climate change, there's different aspects to it. So one of it is that much of the movements we see in that context are, first of all, internal displacement. So I believe I'm not an expert on IDPs, but I believe the vast majority of people moving due to the adverse impacts of climate change and disasters is largely internal displacement. Then there may be situations where people do cross international borders, and we see that. And when we then look at the refugee definitions that are available, especially in the African countries, this is where the 1969 OAU Convention comes into play. And in particular, the aspect of other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So under the OAU Convention, people in that situation could be recognized as refugees and have the rights as refugees. Under the 51 Convention, it might also come into play. And we see that, for example, in situations where the disturbances in the country caused by adverse effects of climate change and disaster somehow exacerbate reasons for the grounds for persecution that exist. So we might see that, for example, ethnic conflicts might be exacerbated because of the climate crisis in the country, just to give an example. So this is how the convention then also comes into play, because it increases the risk that people may be persecuted, for example, based on their ethnicity or on their religion, or it might also have a gender impact, for example. So there are several ways of how the refugee definitions come into play and how they can protect refugees in such a situation. Then there was the question on the Global Compact on Refugees. So I should have maybe mentioned that the Global Compact is a non-binding instrument. So, however, having said that, it was affirmed with a vast majority in the UN General Assembly, and it has really shown that the international community came together and said we need a document that takes a bit of a different perspective on the refugee issue. So and it has taken, as I mentioned earlier, with the objectives that the Global Compact is focusing on, it is really taking this perspective on enhancing the self-reliance of refugees and the burden sharing and the responsibility sharing among the international community. So this is the important angle that the Global Compact is taking, and also, you know, it's a bit in a way different from the refugee convention, so it's somewhat a bit complementary to what the refugee convention sets out. So, like I said, unfortunately, it is not a legally binding document, but we can see that also with the Global Refugee Forum that was set up through the Global Compact, we see that there's really like the topic stays on the agenda also internationally, and there's quite a lot of reference to the Global Compact as well, and it is accepted as a quite an authoritative international document. And then on the last question, on yes, the states that are not a state party to the Refugee Convention, and one second, I lost the question.
It says for countries that are not signatories to the 1951 convention so far,
Right.
what is the role of UNHCR in trying to advise and try to ensure that these countries still legally recognize refugees' access to work?
Right. Thank you so much, Mickey. It is a tricky one. I mean, like I said, we're speaking, the Refugee Convention sits within the wider framework of human rights protection. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is generally a right under human rights to access work, not just limited to refugees. But of course, we can see in some countries that are not state parties that there is some reluctance to provide these rights to refugees. I mean, there is a reason, probably a political reason, for these states not to be state parties to the 51 Convention. So it is very much I would say, a difficult advocacy point to remind states also of their other obligations under human rights law. So this is something that we do as UNHCR, but then again, it cannot be only UNHCR or the ILO. I know the ILO is engaged in that as well. So it is, of course, very helpful when there's other stakeholders who also raise awareness for this and who also come in the advocacy work, which, like I said, we have seen in the Global Refugee Forum. So there's really some potential for that. And sometimes the small steps are the most helpful ones. You know, we might not be able to change a big legal framework, but we might be able to provide, you know, like to like just like move the needle somewhere on specific access or on a specific law to make sure that refugees are included there, and that can already have quite a big impact without, you know, that we might not see usually from the more global, bigger perspective. Did I miss anything?
I think you did an excellent job, Denise. Thank you very much for that. So I have taken note of the three other questions that we have still sort of pending. There's one more question from Manal, but there's also Mariam's question on work permits and Eswari on mixed migration, which I think is super relevant and very timely as well. So let me pause them for the moment. I'll get back to them. I've taken notes on them so that I'm sure I will not miss them, but I would maybe for the moment pass the floor to Heloise to give us a bit of information, a bit of background on the, as you can see now on the screen, on the legislative and policy challenges to socioeconomic inclusion, but also in general to the governance framework that relates to labor market inclusion for refugees and other displaced persons. And then we're going to come back to the discussion at the end of our presentation. Thank you very much, Heloise, and I'll give you the floor directly. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, Miki. So thanks. I have two screens. So hold on one second.
We are now seeing your presentation just for you to know, but not yet in full screen.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Not yet. We're still seeing the PowerPoint screen.
What about now?
Now it is full screen. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think I will, in a way, start by pursuing the discussion, and before talking more specifically about, ILO's role and mandate, I would like to sort of continue highlighting some of the legislative and policy challenges that we may encounter, and that constitutes challenges to socioeconomic inclusion. And let me maybe start with ones that are related to protection generally. So we've talked about refugees being recognized in a country, and let me start with that one, because usually in some cases the refugee status determination process can take a long time. And just an example is South Africa, and that can actually prevent asylum seeker from becoming refugees and therefore accessing the labor markets. There's obviously a lot is a focus on the right to work directly, but there are lots of related rights that will have an impact on how easily or not refugees are able to access the labor market. And a very key one relates to freedom of movement restrictions. As was highlighted in sessions last week, now the vast majority of refugees are more in urban areas, but actually it's not the case for all of them. And there are still refugees who are in remote places, in camps, and therefore maybe far away from sort of economic activities, and the freedom of movement is a key element to support that. When we think of legislative policy, regulatory obstacles, I mean, there are even if we presented the universal right to work, but there are countries who are, putting forward some very strict restriction around the right to work for refugees. Bangladesh is one that comes to mind. In others, it may not be a sort of full prohibition, so to speak, but you may have certain sectors that could be proscribed. This is the case in Iran. And then I know we have several participants from Egypt, and I think also what can be a little bit difficult in some instances is the absence of specific national asylum law and policy that may govern the access to formal employment for refugees. So in a way they can be treated as other foreigners, but not that may not be always sort of such a favorable treatment as we discussed. There was indeed a question on the chat around the prohibition of owning land. I think it's the case in quite a number of countries. There are also prohibitions to holding a business without being done with, with national partners. Those are additional prohibitions that can prevent access to economic activities, especially in areas, in rural areas. I mean, people may still be able to use land, but not own it. So therefore, the income they will make from it would sort of be very limited. Let me move on. Yeah, another related point is restrictions in terms of access to financial services and institutions. And if one wants to set up a business but is not able to open a bank account or have a be able to borrow money, then that is quite a constraint. In the chat, again, there was a very relevant point around work permits. Indeed, in many contexts, in order to work, refugees will be required to have a work permit. And this can be a challenge because they're often costly, or there are limitations, quotas, or they are conditional to having an initial job offer. So I think there's certainly a discussion that we can have around this to, well, first maybe facilitate access to work permit for refugees when this is required, or also, I know this is a discussion we've been having in the ILO, could refugee be exempted from work permits because it is actually a barrier. I want to also highlight that there is often in many contexts knowledge gaps about the rights refugee have. Even for experts, this is as Denise was presenting, it is complex area, and there are lack of awareness of refugees themselves, often because of legal barriers, but also very often of employers and even workers' organizations who could support them, but in order to do so, they also need to be aware. In addition to the right to work, there are obviously for refugees quite many constraints when it comes to rights at work. We've seen that they have limited access to freedom of association, collective bargaining. Few refugees have access to work-related justice, and there is also a lack of social protection coverage in many contexts. We are seeing a bit of a shift on this, and there will be later in the course a specific session dedicated to social protection. I also wanted to highlight challenges related to skills and qualifications. So really what we have is that combined with labor market challenges that are, intrinsic to the country of asylum, you can have high unemployment rates, restricted market. Well, these legal and policy challenges, what they do is they would slow down or prevent access to formal labor market. They will push refugee into the informal, low skilled, insecure employment, under-regulated sectors, and exacerbate risk of competitions between refugees, migrant, host workers, and this can cause tension. It will create, a risk of decent work deficit and discrimination, also risk of abuses and exploitation. And just more generally, the risk of having important number of refugees falling into poverty. So to try to address some of those challenges, let's now consider a bit more ILO's role after having looked at UNHCR as well. We actually really see our mandate very complementarity, and this is also that dimension is a foundation of our partnership. ILO sees international and normative framework really contributing to ensuring the rights of refugees, displaced persons more generally, to participate in labor market, facilitate their access to decent work. So of course, UNHCR is the agency in charge of supporting refugees' protection and finding solutions for them. But I think it's good to remind ourselves that the ILO has been engaged in labor aspects of refugee response since its inception in 1919. Its constitution and the Declaration of Philadelphia promotes social justice mandates and refer to the protection and interest of workers when employed in countries other than their own. So I will just give you a sort of an overview of some fundamental elements of our mandate that are pertinent and will concern refugees. The first one relates to fundamental principles and rights at work, which cover freedom of association, effective recognition of the rights to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, elimination of discrimination in respects of employment and occupation, and more recently, safe and healthy working environment. The declaration I mentioned earlier, social justice, it reaffirms the fundamental value of freedom, human dignity, social justice, security, and non-discriminations that are essential for sustainable economic and social development and efficiency. Now, let me look at international labor standards. So the ILO, the old ILO, in its 100 years plus of existence, has adopted 119 conventions, 6 protocols, and 208 recommendations that are really creating the basis on the rights at work. And these standards are really applicable in a wide range of areas that are relevant to refugees. So there is no ILO standard that is exclusively dedicated to refugees or forcibly displaced, but all of them are, they're applicable to all workers, and this irrespective of nationality and immigration status, unless otherwise stated. So I think that's for us, that's really a foundation. And then you have more specific comprehensive ILO standards that will more specifically be protecting migrant and refugee workers. And these are highlighted in red. It includes Migration for Employment Convention of 1941, and it's the convention and recommendation, the Migrant Workers Convention of 75, and more recently, the Decent Work and Employment for Peace and Resilience recommendation, and I'll touch on this. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the ILO has a unique supervisory system that helps to ensure that countries implement the conventions and their associated protocols. So conventions and protocols are binding instruments. Recommendations are non-binding. So in addition, let me say a word about the ILO guiding principles on the access of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons to the labor market, because as I mentioned at the very inception of the course, this instrument really forms the basis for having this course in the first instance. It is a non-binding guidance. However, it was adopted by a tripartite meeting of experts, and it's grounded on international labor as well as human rights standards. And really what it seeks to do is it aims to address the need for more equitable responsibility sharing. This concept of responsibility sharing, by the way, is also quite central to the global the compact on refugees with countries impacted. It supports states in considering access to this population to their labor market, whilst balancing the need and expectation of their own citizens. And really, it tries to assist in a concrete way with the creation of decent and productive jobs and to strengthen labor market institutions and programs. I'm not going to go through the different parts of the guiding principles, but just to highlight, because they actually very much match the content of the course. But just to highlight that it is a short but yet very holistic instruments that also consider the entire displacement cycle. So there's obviously a focus on refugees when they're in the host states, but it also considers the question of return and labor market reintegration, and also refugees moving to third countries. The 2016 was a productive year for the ILO. There was another important guidelines that was adopted that year on fair recruitment. And I wanted to highlight it as well because we usually, that instrument is usually mainly used for in the context of labor migrations, but it actually also apply to refugees, and it applies in promoting fair recruitment in conflict and other type of crisis situation. And then the instrument that I mentioned earlier, the Employment and Decent Work for Peace and Resilience recommendation, which was adopted a year after the guiding principles, so in 2017, by the International Labour Conference. So it's really the sort of highest level of ILO instance. And it's an important standard because it's the only one that really addresses employment and other world of work issues in crisis situations arising from conflict and disasters. And it really considers also it's at the crossroad of humanitarian peace building, disaster response, and development initiative. And it has a specific chapter that is dedicated to refugees and returnees, which is very much matching the language of the ILO guiding principles. So those two, for us, those two documents are very, very much complementary to one another. I'm not going to say much on this because Denise has touched on the Global Compact on refugees, but just to highlight that there is a specific paragraph in it on jobs and livelihoods, which actually specifically refers to the two documents that I just mentioned, Recommendation 205 and the Guiding Principles. And this not only, but in parts also explains, ILO very close involvement and really strong support together with UNHCR and many other stakeholders to support the implementation of the Global Compact for refugees. And just lastly, a word, and we will have more opportunity to engage with this topic, but just a word about ILO's engagement on employment and decent work for refugees. As I said earlier, the ILO has engaged on this issue since its inception, but it has substantially increased its refugee portfolio, especially since roughly 2013. And for us, really, we see decent work quite center of the nexus between humanitarian aid, development cooperation, and peaceful cooperation. And we've sort of tried to apply that one ILO holistic approach in the different interventions that we may have on several continents. And then lastly, just to highlight a few key principles for us. One is really the early labor market engagement of refugees. We think that it's essential to support their self-reliance, to address segmentation and exploitations, because as such, refugee can really unleash their full potential as workers, as entrepreneurs, and even as employers. This is also key towards durable solutions. So once voluntary return is possible, where refugees would have benefited from skills, competences that could then contribute to a reconstruction process in a country. Essential for us is the earlier involvement of development actors in this wider refugee response framework, and to strengthen host countries' capacity to absorb the impact of large population movement. This was mentioned several times as indeed being one key challenge. We also support and enable the collaboration with and the inclusion of the private sector, because at the end of the day, of course, the governance framework is essential, but a lot of the employment is provided by, by employers, as well as, also self-entrepreneurs as well in many contexts. And then, obviously, as a tripartite organization, we see the key role of social partners to strengthen protection of workplace rights, ensure equality of opportunity and treatment in working conditions. And that includes wages, social protection, and I think we need to be indeed especially vigilant to the situations of women and youth, who constitute a great part of the entire refugee population, and to workers in low skills and low wage work. Okay, I will stop here so we have enough time left for remaining questions and to pursue the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Heloise. Thank you very much for this overview of the ILO role and the ILO mandate and the key concepts around it. We could maybe go back to the questions that were posed in the chat earlier, and I have directly under my eyes at the moment, I have Eswati's question on the description of what constitutes mixed migration and in what way the UNHCR, but also the ILO can support migrants that may not, or people on the move, let's say, they may not necessarily fall within the characteristic of a refugee, so that they can seek work or recognition in the asylum country. And this was an add-on in a way to Mariam's earlier question on any special measures to negotiate with governments regarding the provision of work permits for refugees to enter the labor market. And I know that you mentioned this in your presentation a little bit, taking into consideration that there are agreements between countries on reciprocal treatment. And she's bringing to light, for example, the experience in Jordan with the temporary work permits that were granted to refugees. And this is something that we may look into in a little bit more details when we work on the case study, because Jordan is one of the case studies that will form part of your group work. And Mariam is saying that this is a successful experience, but for example, in Egypt, it requires a lot of work, specifically with the help of UNHCR. So these two questions are addressed to both of you in a way, on these two issues of the work permit, the reciprocal agreement between different countries, and how the ILO or the UNHCR have engaged with these realities, and then on the concept, on the, let's say, the definition of mixed migration. Thank you both. I don't know, Heloise, if you would like to go first, and then we can pass to Denise.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think the question on mixed migration, let me start with that one, is really important. It's a reality. We did touch on this already a little bit in the session with Roger Zetter when he gave an overview driver of displacement and really engaging with you know, their complexity, and recognizing, you know, whilst recognizing the importance of the 51 convention, also acknowledging that there are sort of multiple and complex drivers. So there is in the handbook a more specific definition of what is mixed migration, mixed flows. It's really around the fact that you would have people, you know, you would have refugees traveling often using the same means as other types of people who may be migrants or otherwise also trafficked persons. And therefore, it's a little bit, yeah, difficult to assess who's who, and that categorization. Yes, there is a UNHCR definition, but the recognition by states is also often, you know, sometimes political. I remember we mentioned briefly, and we can maybe touch on this with Denise as well. The situation of Venezuelans displacement, where you would have some of them. I mean, they will all of them mainly flee because of the same reason. And Denise mentioned in one of her slides the Cartagena Declaration definition, which refers to you know, a sort of disorder in the public disorder. So they could broadly fall within that wider refugee definition. Yet few would actually apply for refugee status, but states in the regions have actually very generously ensured their inclusion in the labor markets through different means. So in a way, they would have a little bit more of the status of a migrant. Yet one could consider that they would broadly fall within the definition of refugees. So I think this is where we get into you know, some of the complexity around this issue. Denise, do you want to add a little bit more on the concept of mixed migration? Because I know UNHCR is also engaging with the issue from your department.
That's right. Thank you so much, Heloise. Yes, I think you already described the challenges very accurately. So when we speak of mixed movements, we usually mean cross-border movement of people who are often moving in an irregular manner, and that involves different groups of individuals that travel alongside each other. So, and that makes it difficult to then identify who of those people is in need of international protection, but also who has certain vulnerabilities. Heloise has also mentioned the issue of trafficking in persons, for example. So at least to the question regarding UNHCR's role within these movements, it's mostly to make sure that within these movements, people have access to asylum procedures. And so that those people who are in need of international protection are able to seek protection. So this is our role within it. If there's people who have other reasons for moving, there's the other partner organization that comes in, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, who has a mandate to look at migrants. So in such situations, we work very closely with IOM because it's basically such situations, both our mandates come into play. So it's important to coordinate closely with each other. But with UNHCR taking the focus on the protection of refugees in these situations. And if you're interested, I can actually briefly put UNHCR's definition for mixed movements into the chat, because I just pulled it up.
Yes, thank you. That would be helpful. And then I would probably ask one of the interpreters to also help with the Arabic translation of the definition if they can, picking it up from the chat. And thank you both for the responses to the questions that we had coming from the chat. And I see here it is: a mixed movement as defined by UNHCR is the cross-border movement of people, generally in an irregular manner, involving individuals and groups who travel alongside each other using similar routes and means of transport or facilitators, but for different reasons. People traveling as part of mixed movements have different needs and different profiles and may include asylum seekers, refugees, victims of trafficking, unaccompanied or separated children, stateless persons, and migrants, including migrants in irregular or in vulnerable situations. So thank you for sharing that. I see that there was also a question in the chat that was posed by Manal. And for this one, I would once again have to ask the assistance of our precious interpreters in the translation. It's a question that came a little bit earlier at 10:52. Or if
yes, so this is the English translation of Manal's intervention in the chat box. She says, I'd like to tell you about the experience of Egypt with the refugees in Egypt. We deal with them as citizens coming to the country or already existent in the country. They are not settled in camps or settlements, but they rather live in apartments and flats.
Okay, thank you. Manal, would you like to take the floor, maybe expand a little bit on this and tell us a little bit more? If you have the opportunity to do so, we're happy to listen. Yes,
Hello.
please. Hello.
أنا منال جمال.
I am Manal Gamal from the Youth Ministry in Egypt, and I am responsible for the empowerment of youth. We host the refugees. We have millions of refugees in our country, and they come from Syria in huge numbers, and from Sudan, and from Yemen and Ethiopia. And these refugees came to our country because of wars, because of violence in their country. They have reached Egypt, and our president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, said that Egypt does not have refugees, but incoming expatriates. They are treated as incoming expatriates, and we do not have tents and settlements for refugees. They live just like any other resident in Egypt, any resident in Egypt and national. They live in flats, apartments, and houses. They own shops and factories. They manage jobs through small projects. They have the right to have their own projects. They can open their own shops, their own factories, but they do not have the right to work in ministries so they do not have to work in ministries and official places, but in any other innovative area, they are allowed to do so. In our ministry, through my department, we give these incoming expatriates, especially the refugees, we give them access to clubs and we give them safe spaces in these youth clubs, and they are engaged with Egyptian residents in these safe places so that they learn about one another, they live together, and they live around these places. And this allows them to access all the sports and cultural activities. And we also work on their economic empowerment. We in our ministry, in collaboration with the ILO, we provide them with training programs to have that allow them to look for jobs. They have access to TVETs, for TVETs that lasts for 10 or 15 days. And this is how they are treated just like the Egyptians. They learn how to look for jobs, how to work within the labor market in Egypt. As a president of this department, I have signed a collaboration and agreement with the UNHCR in Egypt in 2024, and an MOU has been signed with the UNHCR. And according to this MOU, we put in practice activities that aim to engage these refugees and provide them with programs and activities that make them access the labor market. And we collaborate with the ILO within the employment of the youth. The private sector, for example, employs the refugees along with the Egyptians, but these work through contracts, but undetermined time employment. So because we do have specific laws, so this is a problem we would like to solve. As for the collaboration with the UN in general, we work with the UNFPA, we have an MOU with them, and we provide safe places for them within the youth clubs, and they can practice any activity, and they are also enabled to access the labor market. And we also provide them with TVETs to enhance their skills and help them access the labor market. And we also collaborate with the UNHCR, with which we have just signed an MOU for 2024. But Egypt has an MOU with the UNHCR from a very long time. I don't recall the exact number of years, but it's more than 10 years. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Manal. Thank you for this very detailed explanation of the situation in Egypt. And I see that Reda is also saying through the cooperation of the Ministry of Youth and Sports in Egypt and the international organizations, 3 employment forums in the form of job fairs were held during the past years, and therefore this enabled to provide many jobs and job placement for both Egyptian nationals and refugees. So thank you for bringing that to our attentions. We're looking forward to hearing more about the situation in Egypt, but also in the other different participating countries through the peer exchange session, what we call the spotlight session. You will find the information on how to pitch your contribution on the eCampus, and you can let us know a little bit more about the situation in your specific home country, whether it's Egypt or any other of the participating countries that we have represented in this course at the moment. I wanted to also pick up on this one last question that I see in the chat from Gerald, who is asking, how can hosting countries deal with the issue of cultural diversity effects in integrating refugees and forcibly displaced persons in the labor market, given its limited fluidity in low developing countries? I assume that this is directed, considering that it has to do very much with the issue of labor market integration and the specific constraints that it has in developing countries. I assume that this is addressed to Heloise. So Heloise, I will let you take the floor first, and then Denise, if you would like to complement, obviously we're happy to hear from you as well.
Thanks. Yeah, no, this is an interesting question. Because, yeah, I mean, I think when one considers the issue of inclusion, integration, well, there's a labor market, strictly speaking, dimension, but a lot of it is related to indeed, you know, the diversity and for the ILO. There's this question of social cohesion, which is quite essential for us. It's something that really we try to embed in all our refugee response from the inception, and it's really to through our program find means to increase dialogue, joint work through apprenticeships. I mean, there are very multiple ways to do that, but just to try to avoid that divide, lack of communication between usually refugees, other displaced, and host community that it's, I mean, research has shown that it's really that sort of lack of exchange that can, you know, create just usually a lack of knowledge about the others, and therefore can create tension. So yeah, this is definitely something that we promote, and just generally it's I mean, I think this is now a principle that is recognized, but still a challenge in some contexts is that it is really important that we are really trying to address some of the broader challenges around the labor market and including refugees. Usually our response are not specifically for refugees excluding the host community, but rather the other way around, so that, you know, the entire community and society are at large benefits from our intervention. I believe it's a similar approach that's taken by UNHCR. I'll pass over to Denise to also say a word on this.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I just noticed I was not muted. I hope you didn't get a lot of background noise from my side. I'm sorry about that. I actually don't have much to add to this, Heloise, because it's also a bit more of a practical question that goes a bit beyond my insights from the legal perspective. But I believe you will also be speaking further on with other colleagues from UNHCR, I think with Nada as well, from our livelihoods unit, who might be able to give also a bit more of these practical insights, much better than I would be able to. So I would defer to my colleagues when they will join you. There's just one more thing I wanted to add. There was earlier a question on the housing and land and property, and there's quite some guidance on that available in UNHCR's emergency handbook. So I will just put the link in the chat in case this is a topic of interest. We might find some further guidance there as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing the additional material. We still have a couple of minutes if there are any last minute questions that you would like to ask, or any last minute reflections or comments that you would like to bring to the attention of our speakers and of the other participants that are present today. I see that Denise has kindly posted the guidance regarding the question that we received earlier on housing, land and property. And we'll be happy to make this available on the eCampus as well. For the Arabic-speaking participants, I saw earlier that there was a question regarding whether we will provide an Arabic translation of the presentation as well, and the answer is absolutely yes. However, this might take a little bit more time in the sense that we often receive, as you know, as it always happens, there are times where we receive the final version of the presentation maybe a little bit too close to the time of the session, to make sure that both languages are available at the same time. So while we thank you in advance, let's say, for your patience while we send the documents for translations. And we will be happy to share the translation online as soon as it becomes available. So keep an eye on the eCampus, because more material as it is being translated will be posted on the eCampus. And if you have any doubts, or if there's anything that you are not able to access or that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out either to me for the English version or to Marco for the Arabic version. You have the information already in the previous messages that we have sent, but also we'll make sure to highlight, because I realized this morning that we have my own email address and Marion's email address very visible on the eCampus, but Marco is not there yet, so we'll make sure to make it visible as well, so that if you have any issues with accessing the materials, you can reach out to us, and we'll make sure to try and help you and guide you as much as we can. One other point that I wanted to bring up regarding the translation of material into Arabic, and this is because we've seen in this case, we've just had an example. Sometimes the materials that we share, especially the additional material or the potentially, let's say if you want to go a little bit deeper into some of the topics, we may provide some additional references or additional materials for you. Often those materials will be in English only, because this is how they are made available in general to the public on the website or online. So if you see that there are any publications that you would very much like to read that is particularly interesting for you, please let us know. If it's available in English only, we're going to do our best to make sure that at least parts, for example, the executive summary or the key points, are also translated in Arabic. It will be obviously an unofficial translation that will be used for the purposes of the training only, so it should not be circulated outside of the purposes of the training course, but we can make some of that available to you in your language, so that you can also benefit from the additional reading material that we share. So feel free to send us an email with the title and the details, and we'll work on that. And as I said, because this has to be sent to a professional translator, it may take a little bit longer, but we will get there. We will not forget. So I see that there are no further questions in the chat at the moment. I don't see any other raised hands. Let me take this opportunity to extend again a very, very warm thank you to Denise, to Heloise, who have joined us today, for their presentations, but also for the patience with replying to the many, many questions that we had for you both. And also thank you very much to the participants for participating and engaging in such a lively way with the material today, with your many questions and comments. This was, as usual, an enriching experience for us as well. One last word of thanks, as usual, to the interpreters who made it possible for us to offer the session in 2 languages. Thank you for your work behind the scenes. We are having some problems with the scheduling of the second webinar of this week, so I will ask you to be patient with us for a little bit longer. We hope by the end of today to find a solution to the puzzle that the session is proving to be, and we hope to be able to confirm the exact date and time to you by close of business today. So it might be this week, it might be moved to the following week. We're trying to work very hard behind the scenes to make sure that this happens, but it's proving a little bit challenging. So thank you for your patience on that. But let me also remind you that that in case for any reason the session is moved to a different time slot, the session will be recorded anyway. So if by any chance you have conflicting commitments at that time, you will not miss the session in its entirety, but you will be able to review the recording on the eCampus afterwards. We'll try to make sure that it gets posted as soon as possible, so that if you cannot participate live, you will be able to access the recording. Obviously, we are very happy to see you participating live. This is an added value for us and also for you, as it allows you to engage with the speakers in a more direct way. But we understand that sometimes scheduling proves difficult for all the parties involved. So thank you in advance for your patience, and we will send you more information as soon as we have it. Thank you all, and we can, I think, consider the session officially closed for today. And we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.